So much new information, great panelists, and we have a new set of panelists that I'm really excited about. So I will pass this over to Julie Gary, who is a board member on the YWCA board, and she is going to be the moderator for the session. And thank you again. Excuse me, feel free to get up and have coffee or get yourself some cookies as you need it.
Cookies. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you all for coming. Just some house rules. There are Post-its in your chair and pens. If you were lucky enough to get an old YWCA pen that turns into a phone stand, then God bless you. Tonight we're going to do something a little differently. We're going to silence phones. I'm going to try to turn this up because I do not project as well as our panelists.
Yeah.
But
My phone went off on purpose.
oh, perfect. Thank you for keeping us on time. So we are going to take your questions via Post-it so that we can put themed questions together and make sure that we streamline and make the process efficient. We also are going to have think tanks immediately following the panel Q&A. So when you are absorbing all of this great information from our experts who took time out of their very busy, important lives to be here with us, just think about also ways that we can take action based on what you hear. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce them. To my left, I have Mario Flores, who is the Director of School Climate and Culture for Hartford Public Schools, where he oversees character education, restorative practices, attendance, discipline, behavior management, and crisis prevention. Sudhira Gordon is not the next person, she's the third person. Is the Executive Director of the Connecticut General Assembly's Commission on Equity and Opportunity, where she advocates to policymakers for constituents on behalf of the African American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Latino and Puerto Rican populations of Connecticut. Second, is the Deputy Director of the State of Connecticut's Commission on Human Rights. And she is the second in command of the oldest governmental civil rights agency in the nation, which is pretty big. And last but not least, we have Leon Smith, who's an attorney at the Center for Children's Advocacy in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he directs the Racial Justice Project, which seeks to protect the civil rights of youth of color subjected to policy and practices resulting in racial disparities in educational outcomes and juvenile justice and culture. So, each of our panelists have prepared about 5-minute presentations on their spheres of work for you so that you can have an understanding of the problem and how all of it
Can everyone hear me, and should I use the microphone? So, Leon Smith, I'm an attorney at the Center for Children's Advocacy. I've been practicing law since 2001, and during the entirety of that time, in practicing both education law as well as practicing in juvenile court, I've been up close and personal in advocating for young people who unfortunately get drawn into the school prison pipeline. We hear that terminology, but what exactly is it? Envision the school to prison pipeline as actually being multiple pipelines which lead our young people from their schools, in which we know education is really the most important thing for our young people, but instead of school and education being what elevates them, school ends up being the gateway into the juvenile justice and later the criminal justice system. How does that happen? Both directly and indirectly. Indirectly, it happens through repeated suspensions and expulsions, which lead to school disengagement. We understand that once young people become disengaged from school and they remain disengaged, that then leads to dropout, which leads to idle time, which far too often leads to young people ending up in the juvenile and criminal justice system. You also have the direct pipeline, which is school-based arrest, whereas when exhibiting characteristics that many of us may have exhibited at times in our lives, getting into an argument in the hallway, maybe getting into a shoving match in gym class, instead of that being treated as a school discipline matter, suddenly that kid is arrested, they are charged, and they are directly drawn into the justice system. And what we've learned over the years is once kids hit the juvenile justice system, oftentimes they tend to stay in the juvenile justice system. how does this really relate to Connecticut, and how does this relate to girls of color? In the state of Connecticut, when you look at that indirect pipeline of suspension and expulsion, girls of color, specifically black girls, are 5 times as likely to be suspended as white girls. So you have similar types of behaviors, but yet black girls are far more likely to be suspended. And you compare, looking at boys, Hispanic boys and black boys are 2 to 3 times as likely to be suspended as their white counterparts, but the gap is much larger with girls. When you look at school-based arrests, and again, oftentimes these are for misdemeanor level offenses, things that at one time were handled in a school disciplinary matter. In Hartford Public Schools in the 2016-17 school year, 85% of the girls who were arrested in school were girls of color. 63% of those were black girls. Not picking on Hartford, you look at the city of New Haven, 90% of the girls arrested in school were girls of color. Bridgeport, 93% of girls arrested in school were girls of color. So these are situations where we have young women who are arrested in school and who find their way into the system. And so what we have to do, those are just the numbers, and numbers don't lie, so we have to ask ourselves, why? Why are girls being suspended, being arrested, and pushed into this pipeline? And that's a lot of the work we do in the Racial Justice Project. And we really parse out if there are similar types of behaviors, why is it treated so differently? And we have to look at how stereotypes drive these things. So when we're looking at girls of color, particularly black girls, there are stereotypes of black women that have been present for hundreds of years. So when you think about implicit bias, are those stereotypes in mind, which causes people to look at the behavior of black girls and to judge it more harshly than you do with white girls. I would say that anytime I look at a school discipline report or a police report, there are certain buzzwords that I look for. If I see aggressive, defiant, rude, to me that triggers, because there's a stereotype called the sapphire stereotype that for years has been imposed upon black women, and I'm thinking, okay, why are you choosing those words? I've had kids as young as 6 and 7 years of age who are trying to ask questions. What do we tell our kids? If you don't know something, ask a question. I've had kids who are in elementary school be disciplined, be put in school suspension for being disruptive for asking questions. And this is what we're talking about, where you have a set of behaviors, kids engaging in behaviors, those behaviors being judged differently, and those lead to kids being out of school, where they're not in school during those hours of the day, where they're more vulnerable to getting in trouble, or being arrested for certain types of behavior and ending up in the system directly. So that's sort of the overview. And when you look at those gaps and those disparities, we're a progressive state, and yet we still have those realities.
Thank you. Spirit, can you talk to us about the policies, the public policies that have happened in the last 5 years? Give us a bit of a legislative landscape.
Yeah, well, Leon kind of gave a really good overview of kind of what the problem is. So historically, systems are put in place to keep certain people in place, and that's what the direct girls. So for the last couple of 5 or so years, we've been actively dismantling a system that was built to keep certain people in and keep certain people out. So I can give you a quick highlight. So one of the things that we've done is we've created alternatives to suspensions and expulsions for school violations. For example, a kid who's wearing his hat backwards, that could trigger a suspension. Or in many Latino families, if you, as a Latino, you do not look a person of authority in their eye. When you go up to them and in school it comes out, why did you look me in my eye? You're suspended. So looking at a lot of those kind of things that are subject to interpretation, and looking at that kids should not be suspended or expelled for a school violation. They're not breaking a law, they're just doing something that you, school person in the building, decided that these were the rules, and they have nothing to do with learning, they're not disrupting anyone else in the school system. And then we also said that you cannot suspend a child under 3rd grade. So if there's so many studies, one that came out of Yale that showed that kids in preschool and kids in first grade and kindergarten, kids of color were being suspended at these really alarmingly high rates. And I have a 6-year-old. He's healthy. But like at the end of the day, like he doesn't need to be suspended because he's a hyperactive 6-year-old boy who probably can't sit in his seat. We've also looked at chronic absenteeism, right? So in many of our urban districts, kids are not going to school for many reasons. Instead of addressing why they're not going to school, we've decided to say, well, you're not going to school, now you're sure you're going to go into the court system. So we made a transition from the court system into CSSD to see how we will figure out why kids aren't going to school and making sure that we're using restorative practices and not throwing them into school for environment. And then we also looked at restorative practice training for professional development in alliance districts. So alliance districts are the outliers in many of these issues. Why? Because there's more black and brown kids in alliance districts. So we have to make sure that we're implementing restorative practices and dismantle that system that was created, as I said at the beginning, to keep certain people in place. So we've done a lot of really good work. I don't know if we've actually seen the end result that we would like to, but it's still relatively new. I think the really big push started maybe 2014 or 2015 to try to change some of these policies. And initially, we had said you can't suspend under 3rd grade unless it was for something that's violent. And then we had to go back to that and say, if a 7 or a 6-year-old's fighting, we really need to think about why is that 6-year-old fighting. I don't think it's the 6-year-old's fault. Maybe they haven't learned certain things that teach them how to deal with their emotions. They haven't learned conflict resolution. So we kind of went back and changed that. So even if a 6-year-old's violent, we still think there should be a restorative practice and they shouldn't be suspended out of school for that. So that's just kind of there are many other things that we're doing and we're working on, but those are some of the big things that I can highlight that we've done starting in 2014, 2015 to address the school to prison pipeline and to keep kids outside of that space.
Great, thank you. Mario is going to provide us a presentation.
Sure.
On school strategies.
Yeah, and it's crazy because our work overlaps, and I'm working with the Center for Children's Advocacy now with the Racial and Disparities Committee with the City of Hartford. It's chaired by Martin Snow from the CCA, as well as Kamala from the Department of Families, Children, Youth, and Recreation for the city. And initially it was called the Disproportionate Minority Contact Committee, and we just somebody decided that it was more progressive to use racial and ethnic disparities, and that's where we're at as we look now. We know the problem, right? It is disproportionate discipline and disproportionate on a continuum of an upward scale. The more severe the consequence, the more propensity that we target kids of color. Right now, it was very jarring for our administrators and our staff members to learn that the most targeted group in the city, in our Hartford Public Schools, are black boys. The next group, and I ask administrators all the time, who's the next group? And they'll say, well, brown boys. I say, no, it's black girls. So black girls have now surpassed Latino brown boys as the next targeted group. So what we're seeing is increased out-of-school and in-school suspensions, even though we have decreased out-of-school suspensions in our public schools by about 5,000 since I came on board in 2012. Most of our suspensions, we do use restorative practices, so we're trying to keep the kids in school. Most of them, they've done this, right? Out of school, now became in school, and we're kind of here. So in-school suspensions are usually what we use. We've been able to keep it, right now I think in total we're at about 750 out-of-school suspensions for the year amongst 20,000 kids in 47 schools. It sounds high, but in relation to other districts, we're actually below average. And I'm in no way defending our disciplinary practices because I do understand that there are problems in our practice. We have an increase of reporting for physical aggression and fighting. So we're seeing that our black girls are engaging, and our girls of color, our girls period, are engaging in more aggressive behaviors. And it's more how you deal with it. We talk about subjectiveness when it comes to how you perceive something to be, but we are seeing at least reporting of that more often. I am personally doing a lot of formal conferencing through the restorative approach in schools where I'm mediating a lot of groups now. So it's not a lot of one-on-one fights, it's more group fights. And lastly, a lot of instigation on the boys' side, getting the girls to fight. And that's anecdotal, qualitative, empirical evidence that I have from my own work in Hartford all I do is run around and try to make sure I put out fires before they become something huge. We had a big fight in front of Burger King on Main Street, that a kid went Facebook Live, and it was a 5-on-5 girls fight. It was crazy, right on Main Street, right across the street from City Hall. So it's out there, it's happening, and we have seen instigation and the impact of social media, which I'll touch on in a minute, is really helping, at least exacerbate that kind of behavior. So why is it happening? We do have lack of cultural competence and implicit bias by our staff. So you're hearing the overlap already with the work that we're doing, the things that we're seeing, and the work that the advocates are doing for kids at the legislative level and at the advocacy level. Right. I'm trying to read my presentation. They don't look like our kids, right? So I just pulled up some data real quick for you guys. As far as teachers, they're 76% female, and this is literally hot off the presses as of yesterday. 76% white, 10% Hispanic, 13% black. Our kids are 50% Hispanic, 40% black, 10% white. So you see this proportionality with our staff. Of course, we can talk about the why, in terms of why we don't have enough minority recruitment going on, or are we getting enough people of color into the pipeline in education in order to get people of color back in urban districts. One of the jarring things with looking at this data is our SSOs, which are our school safety officers, our security guards, are 86% people of color. Right? So the research out there in terms of people of color being essentially the overseers with the white administrator, white teacher, is playing itself out in our data. So we see that every single day. I supervise all the behavioral technicians in the district. I have 40 of them. All but 3 they're mostly male, but all but 3 are people of color. So we're seeing the behavioral support staff and the enforcers, if you will, being people of color, but leadership and teachers do not reflect our population in the city, and of course that plays into implicit bias, stereotypes, etc. Lack of conflict resolution skills is huge. And that is more lack of support by adults. They don't know how to normally mediate people of color, kids of color, girls of color. They don't understand the impact of the desensitization of violence in our city. We grew up fairly violent in Hartford. I went around in Hartford since I was 15, 16 years old. In the mid-90s, it was Solids, Lion Kings, 20 Love, right? 20 Love at the north end, Lion Kings had a part of the south end, and the Solids had a part of the south end. We are seeing more. I remember the first time I saw somebody get hit in the face. It puts a feeling in your stomach. I no longer feel that. My timeline is full of fights. Our kids, their timelines are full of fights. So they become so desensitized to violence that it's no longer, it doesn't have the impact that it did back in the day, and our staff doesn't know how to deal with that. The social media, the lack of validation by staff for what social media means to our kids is huge. To give you an example, we had a big fight at one of our high schools. I went in to mediate. When I got into the room, a police officer was already having a mediation with the students. And mediation meant something to the effect of, why are we here? To go to school. What do I think about social media? It's stupid. Are you going to Snapchat? No. As soon as he left, I said, did that make sense to you at all? He said, no. I said, all right, we're going to start all over, forget all that. So we have to think about what social media is doing to validate our kids. They're validated by likes. I myself have 1,000 followers on Instagram